Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's event hosted by the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. My name is Lauren-Brooke. I'm Senior Fellow here at the Brennan Center and your moderator for today's program. The Brennan Center, as many of you know, is a nonpartisan law and policy institute that works to reform and revitalize our systems of democracy and justice. You can keep up with our work online at brennancenter.org. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, watch our videos on YouTube, and listen to our podcasts on iTunes. And I believe today's event will also be turned into a podcast if you'd like to listen to it again. For decades, prosecutors have wielded tremendous power and played a key role in our justice system. Recently, the role of prosecutors has become a focus of criminal justice reformers who argue that to truly reform and transform today's criminal justice system, prosecutors need to lead the change to promote a more fair and compassionate justice system for all. To talk about this growing movement for change in prosecution, we are thrilled that New York Times writer and Truman Capote Fellow at Yale Law School, along with, as many of you know, co-host of Slate's Political Gabfest podcast that everyone at the Brennan Center listens to, Emily Bazelon discusses her new book, Charged: The New Movement to Transform American Prosecution and End Mass Incarceration. Emily mounts a major critique of the American criminal justice system and follows a new wave of prosecutors who have been elected across the country in some of our biggest cities and some of our most rural areas. And these prosecutors are reinventing how their jobs are done. We are thrilled that two veteran prosecutors are here to join us today. Both of these prosecutors are known for their innovative approaches and practices to change culture from the inside. Directly to my right is Eric Gonzalez, District Attorney from Kings County, New York, better known as Brooklyn. When he took office in 2017, he became the first Latino district attorney in New York State, leading one of the largest prosecutors' offices in the country that serves more than 2.5 million people in Brooklyn, New York. Two seats down, we are joined by Dan Satterberg, who hails from the Pacific Northwest and has been the King County prosecutor since 2007. His district includes the city of Seattle, Washington, and employs more than 225 attorneys who handle over 25,000 cases a year. Immediately to Mr. Satterberg's right is Miriam Krinsky, who was a former federal prosecutor for 15 years and is the current executive director of an organization called Fair and Just Prosecution that seeks to train and nurture a new generation of prosecutors. Welcome to the Brennan Center for Justice. And thank you again to everyone on this panel for taking the time out of your schedules to discuss and share your experiences about how to truly transform prosecution in the 21st century. And Emily, I want to start with you. So everyone should join us in congratulating Emily. Today is officially her book launch. And
Thank you.
And as Sydney noted when she introduced the program, Emily's book will be for sale afterwards, and Emily will be signing copies of her book.
Very happily.
And Emily, you so eloquently and grippingly described in your book why prosecutors play such a pivotal role in the justice system. And you also track this movement to elect prosecutors that really are trying to transform the way that justice is done in this country. Ones who are focused more broadly about the scope of a prosecutor's job. even focused on reducing the number of people who are behind bars, which is, simply a 180 from what prosecutors have been doing for decades in this country. You're a writer for the New York Times. You could have written a book about a lot of different things. Why did you choose to write about prosecutors and this new movement to elect reform-minded prosecutors?
So first of all, thank you all so much for coming. It's really a pleasure for me to see all of you out here thinking about absorbing the new conversation about these issues. When I started thinking about this book in 2015, and when I wrote a proposal for this book, I thought I was going to be writing about the power of prosecutors and the damage that has done, the way that prosecutors have mostly used their power to put more and more people in prison. And I wrote a book proposal that was an argument about why that's been so problematic, trying to show its development, looking at the kind of legislative shift to mandatory sentencing, the rise of plea bargaining. And then I had a really happy coincidence happen while I was working on the book, which was that this movement arose kind of underneath my feet, making the issue, for me as a journalist, much more interesting, because following change, especially optimistic change, is something that you don't get to do all the time in my profession, right? We spend a lot of time talking about problems, and we should, and I should say there are so many problems that remain in criminal justice. But to also be able to report on people who are trying to do things differently, that has been the real pleasure and joy of this book. And so the stories I tell in the book are designed to kind of illustrate these two sides of criminal justice in America. I argue that we're at a crossroads. And so I told a story about an old school law and order prosecutor in Memphis, and then a story about Brooklyn that features Eric Gonzalez's office as a way of looking at these two different ways of doing the job.
And your storytelling device in the book is sort of really pulls you in. Can you talk a little bit about how you chose that narrative to tell the story? So a little bit more about those two characters.
Yeah, sure. So one of the characters, the story in Memphis, is about a woman named Nora Jackson, who was charged with killing her mother when she was 18. That's now, I think, 12 years ago, 13 years ago. And so that is a story of a case in which prosecutors, I decided very early that Nora was the suspect. The DNA results in the case then came back, excluded her. The prosecution nonetheless continued and kind of unfolds from there. And I was interested in that case. It's got a lot of gripping detail, and Nora is, to me, riveting person. But I also, the office that case was prosecuted in Memphis has a pattern of failing to disclose evidence in murder cases where the stakes are very high. And I was just really surprised, like as a citizen, that was possible, that you could have kind of repeated instances of prosecutorial misconduct, serious violations of people's constitutional rights that would go unaddressed. So that was the sort of question I went into with that case. The second case I chose came out of a specialized gun court in Brooklyn. And I was interested in a few things there. This sort of tension, I think, between getting guns off the streets, a goal that is hard to argue with, and then the reality of having mandatory prison sentences, which is how New York law works, for people who get caught with a gun. There are lots of reasons why people, especially in poor African-American neighborhoods in Brooklyn, have guns. They talk about protection. There are, of course, lots of parts of the country where the NRA is fighting hard to protect people's right to have a gun. They were not showing up in Brooklyn. And then I got really interested in a diversion program that Eric's office has been running for years, that is for people accused of felonies, even violent felonies, because gun possession counts as a violent felony in New York. That's really unusual. I still haven't found another program like it around the country, though I don't want to rule it out, because it's a big America. And so I followed the story of a young man who I call Kevin in the book because I'm protecting his safety and his privacy. I followed his case through, and it was all happening in real time, which is an exciting and also kind of risky thing to do as a journalist. You just don't know how it's going to turn out. But I wanted to use his case to illustrate both the possibility of this harsh sentence and then the possibility of a second chance that he was receiving.
So, Eric, this program is in your office, and you now oversee this program. And you've also recently just rolled out some very new initiatives that I think district attorneys across the country are following. Your Justice 2020 initiative has just stated publicly, and I think you might be the only prosecutor's office in the country, correct me if I'm wrong, that has said this, but that alternatives to incarceration are the default, and incarceration will now be the alternative in your office. You've also recently rolled out other new initiatives, such as hiring 2 immigration attorneys on staff who will look through cases for defendants who might have collateral consequences related to their immigration. So these are really bold, really visionary changers. Can you talk a little bit about what some of the challenges have been rolling out these initiatives within your office and also out in the wider community?
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a very broad question, but my belief is that in order to keep my county and to keep my city safe, and particularly Brooklyn, that the work we do as prosecutors, in order to promote safety, has to also really make sure that we are earning community trust in the things that we do. And I've challenged the assistant DAs to ask themselves 2 questions on every case they handle, and really push back against being case processors, that because a case has been, an arrest has been made by the police department, that we automatically have to have certain outcomes with those cases. And the 2 questions are very simple. Is what you're about to do or trying to do, is it going to keep community safe? And will it promote or will it push against public trust in our justice system? And quite frankly, I've spent nearly 24 years as a prosecutor. I grew up in Brooklyn. I grew up in East New York. I think a lot of you, if you've read the book, you may know that. And I grew up in a community that was a high crime neighborhood during the 80s and 90s, in a neighborhood where there was not a lot of trust in our justice system. And I became a prosecutor to do 2 things: to make sure people who grew up in East New York, like my family, could feel some sense of safety, but also because I thought that maybe over time, people like myself could help change the system. And for me, it's very clear. Our criminal justice system has become too large. It's overblown. We take in cases all the time that have nothing to do with public safety. We take in cases that actually do the opposite of promoting public trust, and we needed to focus our energies on cases that actually keep us safe. So I'm trying to shrink the system, but I'm also doing something that I think a lot of newer DAs agree, which is that it can't simply be about punishment. And I've been talking to the assistant DAs in my office that accountability is not the same, it's not synonymous with punishment. But accountability is about making sure people take ownership for what they did wrong. We try to figure out how to prevent them from doing that again, and they make some kind of redress for the harm that they caused to our society. So this program that deals with gun offenders, and it's not very highly appreciated by our police department here in New York City.
Oh no, they love it.
It's been a source of a lot of tension between my office and law enforcement. But my thoughts on this are pretty simple, that a lot of these young men are arrested with guns. They weren't using the guns. They weren't committing crimes with the guns. But the fact that they had the gun was a danger to the community and to themselves. So we needed to have interventions in their lives. But we did not need to warehouse them upstate for a minimum of 3.5 years, especially the younger folks who, we deal from 16 to 24, 25 years old. And really, I've looked at this for a while now. I see rap sheets every single day in my life where someone has been arrested for a gun and goes upstate, comes home, and commits more crime. So that sort of accountability by sending someone to prison didn't make us safer. It just brought back more violent people. our interventions are meant to do cognitive behavioral change so that these young men will drop the gun and leave the gun alone and move on and be productive with our lives. And it's a small sample, but it's important that I'm doing it because it's proof that we can, in fact, work with people who've been charged with violent crimes.
And Emily, in your book, the character Kevin is one of those people who wasn't using the gun for a crime, but likely just, told the police that that was his gun because his friends had criminal records. So.
Yeah, I mean, right. He was 19 at the time, and his thinking was, so he was in an apartment, a friend's apartment. That friend had flashed this gun on Facebook the day before. That was why the police had a search warrant. Kevin happened to be the one who opened the door, and the gun was like lying behind him on a table, and he had this kind of split second. He knew his friend who owned the apartment had a record and was going to really be going upstate for a long time if he got caught. And I think the sort of rash, youthful impulse of this, to me, is captured in the fact that one thought that flashed through Kevin's mind was he could grab the gun and flush it down the toilet. Like, not going to work. But that was what he said he was thinking in that moment. And then once he had the gun, he said to the cops, like, I'm going to be a man and take the charge. And I think there's a lot there about someone's conception of manhood and also this notion of loyalty to his friends, that he was trying to spare other people. Now, I mean, you can dismiss all of this as like misguided, but I think a lot of teenagers, my sons who are that age might have a similar impulse, but in a different circumstance. Anyway, so that is the beginning of that case. You're right.
And Dan, you are also known for some incredibly innovative practices in your office, specifically law enforcement assisted diversion. So for those less familiar with it's called LEAD, to those folks who are familiar with the program, you started one of those programs in your office, and it's now considered a model for police and prosecutors across the country, and it's being expanded in New York and many other states. Can you talk a little bit about how you helped to start that program, and as well as any challenges that existed when you were trying to, I'm sure you had no challenges, when you tried to start the program?
So yeah, thank you. And so I have been a prosecutor for 34 years. I've been elected for the last 12. So I'm not one of the new wave who has run against an office. I'm one of the old dogs. And Miriam's group has brought the old dogs and the new wave together. And what I tell the newly elected prosecutors is that your discretion is your superpower. Prosecutorial discretion can be a bad thing, but it can also be something that you use to engage with the community in new ways. And I think that the essence of the 21st century prosecutor needs to be to do things on purpose to bring the community into your work. And nowhere, I mean, the easy end quotes, the low-hanging fruit for criminal justice reform has to be how we deal with drug addiction. Because we all now say that substance use disorder is a disease. It's a brain disease. People can be helped. They can get better. You can't punish people into sobriety, but you can make a connection with people in your community who understand how to work with people who are in the grips of addiction. So a number of years ago, we were being sued by the Public Defender Association in my city, we being the Seattle Police Department, also my office, because they said that we were using, the police were putting their resources into areas that particularly were communities of color, making cases against against mostly black defendants in the city courts. It was not unique to Seattle. I think throughout the country that's what was happening. It was easier to go, you could walk down the street with a $20 bill in full police uniform and you could probably make a buy because they were selling it to anybody. What we did, we got sued unsuccessfully over years, and then one day we sat down in my office and I said to the public defender and the police chief who was there, like, what do you guys want? And they said, well, we want the police to have another option when they make an arrest. And the police said, well, that's what we want too. And so soon we got some money, some grant money, and we created this additional tool for police officers. So when someone is arrested in Seattle for a drug possession or a drug-related crime, that the officer has the discretion to call for a case manager instead. Instead of taking that person to jail, they might take them back to the police precinct, call the case manager, and the deal is within an hour, that case manager is going to show up, they're going to do the warm handoff, and And if that person engages with the case manager, then the prosecutor agrees to never file that case. And so the case manager has to have some resources. They have to have housing. They have to have all sorts of emergency medical things, because people who have serious drug addictions often have other medical issues too. So it's really a persuasive thing. We don't force people into it. It's a harm reduction format, which is important, because we know that harm reduction is the thing that works. So what people who have become addicted to drugs lose is any sort of connection to friends or family or people who want to help them, and pretty soon they just surround themselves with other compulsive drug seekers. So the idea of LEAD, and it was to create that avenue for help for people who have addictions. Over the years, now we've done it now for 8 years, and last year I made using my superpower of prosecutorial discretion, I said I'm not going to prosecute people who possess under a gram of heroin or cocaine or methamphetamine. It's just not doing anybody any good, and instead we're going to use the money that we were spending, about $3 million a year, to process people through the courts with no help. We're going to use that money instead to continue to expand the LEAD program. So that's an area where I think we had to accept the fact that there are inherent limitations to the court system, and we have a drug court, and our drug court is very successful. There's 350 people in it, but the people who are in our drug court are facing years in prison. The people who were being picked up for small possession cases were facing days in jail, and they weren't going into drug court. So we had to find some other way to use that arrest as an intervention point, so that people in the community who know how to work with people who are addicted could have their role too. So before that we said, we got this. The criminal justice system, we got this drug thing. Guess what? It didn't work out very well. So this is the philosophy behind it, is to turn it over to people who know what they're doing.
And were you able to repurpose some of the prosecutors in your office on different types of cases?
Well, obviously, we have serious violent cases in Seattle too, and that's where we want to spend our time. And we are not drug counselors, and so yeah, we don't do those cases anymore. And again, the police weren't super happy about it, and there's a backlash of people who say, I've legalized heroin in Seattle, and everyone's going to come to Seattle now because we don't prosecute people. We're not seeing that, but what we are seeing is that through intentional partnerships with the community, that people are getting help and they're getting better.
And Miriam, you have created this ambitious national program to help support newly elected, and in Dan's words, old dogs as well, reform-minded prosecutors who are hoping to really shift the way that justice is done in their offices. And you and I worked together, the Brennan Center worked with Fair and Just Prosecution, and I've never asked you, and I'm curious, how did you know that there was such a need?
I don't know that we did know. I think that our feeling was, let's fill a space that looks like and feels like it needs to be filled, and let's see how it goes. And we really saw this opportunity and the moment that was a unique moment, with individuals like Eric, DA Satana DeBerry from Durham is here, just recently elected, and she came in sort of more recently, but when we looked around in 2016 and saw the individuals who had come into office and knew full well just how lonely and challenging the job can be, that change is never easy, that cultures in offices run deep, and that it's not easy to kind of do things in a different manner, and as Eric said earlier, and as Dan has been doing for some time, to commit to shrinking the size of the justice system, to commit to a view that we've criminalized too much for too long, that we've got a justice system that for too long has tried to treat through imprisonment and through punitive responses individuals who are suffering from substance use disorder, who are struggling with mental illness, who are simply reflecting the manifestations of poverty, that individuals who are really trying to take to heart, how do we change that paradigm? How do we own, as prosecutors, as Dan so passionately talked to our group about, how do we own more, really from cradle to grave in terms of a person's life, and say that the job of prosecutors should be to create healthy and safe communities. We can over-police our way to safer communities, but how do prosecutors own the need to make their communities healthier places. So when we started to hear these views, we realized that this was a different moment in time, and that somehow we needed a space where these bold new thinkers could come together and feel that they had a community and that they weren't alone, that they could come together and share the challenges, the struggles, and also share new ideas and have a chance to learn from each other and to learn from some of the best expert thinkers in the country. So, I think our view was, let's see what this looks like and feels like. And after the first meeting where we brought these folks together, a number of them came back and said, please don't stop. Let's keep this going. We need that community. We need that place where we can safely talk through and support each other. And we need a group that's going to be there to lift us up and also come in as firefighters when things start to blaze in our community, because not everyone is going to agree with this new thinking that we're bringing to the mix.
And Emily, in your book, you write that New York Times journalist Clyde Haberman noted that these DA candidates, and I'm quoting from his article and your book, sound like they're running for public defender, not prosecutor. And that really struck me as a reader. This is a marked shift from the punitive criminal justice, tough on crime rhetoric. There was this sort of phrase, you couldn't run for dog catcher for decades unless you were tough on crime. And now we have the highest law enforcement officials running on a sort of empathetic, smart on crime platform, which is very, very new in the history of our country. What do you think about his quote? And do you think that really reflects what's been happening in the movement?
I don't think it really reflects what's happening, but I think the assumption is quite revealing, that if you position yourself as being, as trying to redefine what safety means, like when Eric's talking about this, that's what I hear, that law and order DAs would also say that safety was their priority, but they think the way to get to safety is strict punishment, which often means imprisonment, and that's their job. It's to lock people up who do bad things. When crime was really high, most of the country was very receptive and committed to that message. So now crime is down, and that opens a space to think about it differently. And you can start to ask questions like, well, wait a second, the rate in the United States for solving murders is 60%. That's low compared to other Western democracies. So maybe safety involves the kind of trust that Eric and Dan and other folks here are trying to build in their communities, because if people trust the law and they see it as legitimate, if they see the criminal justice system as having a purpose that can support their lives and communities, well, maybe they'll go to the cops when they see a crime. Maybe they'll show up as witnesses in court. Problems, there are these gaps that their lack of desire to do that creates in solving cases and solving homicides and shootings. So I think that redefinition of safety is crucial. But what you see from this idea that if you have that goal, that you're acting like a public defender, that suggests that prosecutors can't also share those values. And I think what you're seeing from this movement is a real pushing back. And I think also it's so important to give credit to the organizers who helped this movement grow and have been so much behind these campaigns, because they are making DAs answer to a different constituency. And that makes all the difference. It turns out these are local elections. Not all that many people vote. You can make a big impact on your local criminal justice system without having to address, gridlock in Washington or these big, insoluble feeling national problems that we have.
And in Emily's book, she writes, the culture of a DA's office, more than longevity in the job, shapes whether conviction psychology takes hold. And that really resonated with me, and I know that this is something that Fair and Just Prosecution is working on, which is really how you change culture in offices. Both of you, Eric and Dan, run very large offices with a large number of staff, attorneys, administrative staff. Eric, I'll turn to you first. For decades, prosecutors across the country really have been rewarded for conviction rates, for for more punitive responses to crime. They've been promoted. Chief prosecutors have been elected based on their conviction rates, and things are changing, and both of you are doing things to change that in your offices. So Eric, what have you started to do to change culture in your office around promotion and just really the culture around punitive responses and what a DA's job and their role really should be?
So in order to change culture, and I have a big office, 1,100 plus employees, over 500 prosecutors. Some are junior, some have been there for a decade, and some have been there for 25, 30 years. To change that culture is not going to happen overnight. But one of the things that I think has been a key part of the culture change in the office, the way we hire is different. The kind of questions we ask when we're hiring is a lot different than they used to be. We used to hire people who wanted to be tough on crime and people who wanted to be, the best trial attorneys, and that was really what their goal was, to get into the courtroom and learn how to try cases, as opposed to people who we now speak to who want to do justice on cases and understand it's a different obligation than just going into the courtroom and proving your mettle against an adversary. But for me, I think the most profound change in my office is the acknowledgement that jail or prison doesn't keep us safer. That if we want prosecutors not to be so punitive, right, because we're always going to get slapped down by news media or some other person who wants us to be, very vindictive on our sentences and very tough on our recommendations, that we have to actually have a fundamental belief within the people who are doing the job that when we send someone to prison, it's because we're failing, because we can't figure out another way of safely dealing with that person. And we're saying the only response is to send them upstate, where that possibly they could have some long-term cognitive change in their behavior. But that we believe the things that keep us safe are educational attainment and housing and employment and a real bond and tie to a person, a spouse, a partner, a family member. And then we incarcerate people, we remove them from those things that we know keep people safe, and we go back and forth, and we do that over and over, and then we expect them to become better. So that we need to really use our resources, as Miriam was saying, to make the community stronger and better and healthier, and not to put people in situations where by punishing them, we've now returned them back to the community worse. And we can all talk about our situations with our jails and wherever we come from, but jails are not the place where you're going to make positive social networks. And people come back from jail worse than when we sent them. But they also come back to a community that has all the same problems it had when they first got in trouble. And we have not invested in either the person or the community, so we're setting them up for failure. I saw this firsthand in East New York. I saw this with so many of my friends who I went to school with. So many of my friends in the 80s and 90s, particularly in the 90s, got involved with drugs. And my family still lives in East New York. When I return home to my family home, I still see these guys. They never moved on with their lives because their educational attainment was cut short. They could never get good jobs, and we've stunted their growth. And we lost generations of young people to a criminal justice system that kept saying, well, you're not changing, so we're just going to give you more and more time, instead of giving them the ability to make that change.
And Dan, you've also done a lot to try to change culture and practice in your office. I know that you've brought in cultural competency trainings, implicit bias trainings. You've brought in speakers who can talk about the racial history of our country, which is, I was an assistant DA here in New York, and I never had that sort of training or speakers brought in or implicit bias training. Can you tell us a little bit about why it's so important to change culture in your office and what you've seen?
Sure. So number one, human beings hate change. It makes them very uncomfortable, and lawyers probably more than anyone. So We are taught in wonderful institutions like this all about precedent and about the stare decisis and the things already been decided, so let's move on. That's of course not true at all, and in fact we have tremendous ability to change our practice and our culture. But the first thing I wanted to do was to just understand what the criticisms are of our profession and to invite them into our conversation. So we talk about mass imprisonment, mass incarceration in the United States, and how even though right now we have the crime rate that we had in the mid-1960s, which is we haven't been this safe for 50 years, we lead the planet in incarceration. In fact, if we're going to go back to the incarceration rate that we had in 1965, we'd have to release 80% of the people who are in state and local prisons, and no one wants to do that. But we also have to understand it wasn't always this way. We had a different approach. We bring in speakers. I'm even letting Emily talk to my office, and I haven't even read the book yet. I know there's going to be some criticisms in there, but we're grown up, so we can handle a little criticism. And if it's true, we deserve the scrutiny because we have a lot of power, and we have to understand why people want us to change and understand it. And certainly, racial justice is a big part of that. And I've had mandatory trainings for my entire staff. I made them watch the 13th. A documentary which was very powerful, and brought Jeff Robinson from the ACLU in to talk about. He's got a wonderful 3.5-hour talk about their true history of racial justice that you didn't learn in high school or college. And it's made people uncomfortable, and I've had some backlash, and I've told my people who are uncomfortable, that means you're paying attention. If you're uncomfortable, it means that this is working. So let's start to look at some of our practices, and I agree with Eric in the idea of shrinking our footprint in the criminal justice system. We don't have to be involved in all of these things, and so I hire and promote people who want to be part of changing things and who have creative ideas. And because of those ideas, we're doing things that are in a much different way. And the best ideas come from within. I mean, my ideas are always brilliant, but the ones that stick and are sustainable are the ones where people and people are encouraged to come and say, you know, we do this kind of case, but it really isn't helping. So because of those things, for instance, we don't prosecute people who have suspended licenses because they didn't pay their speeding ticket. That's a driving while license suspended in the 3rd degree. Once someone, you go from a civil infraction to a criminal matter, and once you get into that vortex, you never get out. And you have lots of young people, and being in court doesn't help people get their licenses back. We do have a way to help people who are motivated to do it. So that was about 3,000 cases a year that we no longer do. We no longer do about 1,000 drug possession cases that we used to do. And instead, we're trying to use those resources to do things like we have a brand new unit in my office that takes guns out of people's homes in domestic violence situations. So when a domestic violence victim gets a civil protection order or there's a criminal no contact order, we actually have a unit that's full-time, 12 people who go in with police and execute those orders with the extreme risk protection law in our state as well. So we're taking cases, the people that used to do these meaningless cases, and we're doing something that I know is saving lives. Last year we took over 600 guns out of people's homes at the time when they were in the most danger in domestic violence situations or when someone was suicidal. We were giving effect to that law. So I'd much rather use my resources to help prevent violence than to respond to crimes of poverty or addiction.
And I'd like to add, because when I think about the culture change in the office and why it's so difficult, it's not because there are bad people in the office, and there are people who've committed themselves to trying to keep their community safe, but it's an acknowledgement that the things that they personally did over time have added to community harm, that the things that they've done on behalf of all of you and on behalf of the people that we serve have actually caused harm. And I think it's a difficult acknowledgement to make, that you've done something that you thought was the right thing, or the thing you were told to do, or the thing you were trained to do, and now when you have to reassess, you realize that you've added to harm. And I've come to terms in my own career of the things that I've done that have harmed. You know, I've tried drug cases that we don't even prosecute anymore in my office, but I've tried cases that people have gone to prison for things that I would never even pursue today. So that is one of the biggest, I think, resistance points in district attorney's office, is that you have career prosecutors who are committed to victims, and the amount of, in my office, I hear them talk about victims and protecting victims every day, but understanding that the acts that we've taken on behalf of our community have actually sent us to this place where we have mass incarceration, and we have mass supervision, and we have a lack of trust in our justice system.
And Miriam, your group, Fair and Just Prosecution, does a lot to promote culture change in district attorneys' offices. And recently, a sort of plug for all of our work, FJP and the Justice Collaborative and Emily Bazelon collaborated on a document that Miriam is holding in her lap called 21 Principles for the 21st Century Prosecutor. That is sort of a blueprint, right, for starting to change culture in these offices. Can you talk a little bit about some of those principles? And they are also incorporated in Emily's book at the very end as well.
Sure, and Brennan Center and LB were also a partner in crafting that. So I think Emily, in introducing it in the book, because it is at the end of the book, said that this started with a cup of coffee, and it actually did. I think Emily and I were sitting together, and after hearing and having heard over the months about the great work Emily was doing, I think I sort of looked at her and said, so what are you doing with all of this knowledge you're acquiring? And I think Emily looked at me like I was a bit of a space alien and said, well, I'm writing a book. What have we been talking about? And I said, no, Emily. I mean, the book is going to aptly describe the problems and look for some models, but what are we doing to create a vision and a roadmap for the solution, for where we want to see this field go? And that was where the 21 principles came from. I think Emily sort of said, well, what do you want me to do about it? And I said, well, let's try to answer the question that I guess get asked time and time again, which is, what is a progressive prosecutor? When we talk about this 21st century prosecutor, I mean, other than just pointing and saying, well, there's Dan, and there's Eric, and there's Satana, and there are a host of others, what do we really mean in terms of that blueprint that a newly elected prosecutor could grab and say, if I really want to think about doing it right, what does it look like? So we worked over many months and got input from Dan and Eric and a cast of many others that I know with some of my staff there, it started driving them crazy. Are you giving it to one more person for input? And we tried to define the roadmap that is predicated on two pillars. One is, how do we reduce the size and the footprint of the justice system, as both Dan and Eric have alluded to? So what are a series of principles and strategies that are going to shrink the system? And second of all, how do we try to increase fairness? How do we create a system that is accountable, that is transparent, that embraces procedural justice? And what does that look like? And how do we get prosecutors to understand, as Emily talks about and others so well, that compassion and mercy and a just system is not inconsistent with public safety. In fact, it's the essence of public safety. So the principles include, and getting them down to 21 took a little bit of discipline. I think we started in the high 40s. But some of them got combined together. But it includes things like principles around how do we treat kids like kids and realize that young people remain stupid with developing brains into their 20s. No aspersions cast on those in the room in their 20s. But how do we have a system that acknowledges that building brain? How do we embrace thinking around treating rather than criminalizing individuals who are struggling with mental illness, with substance use disorder, with poverty? How do we develop principles that recognize the poverty penalty, meaning reforming cash bail, ending fines and fees? How do we think about what it looks like to have a system where incarceration is the alternative rather than the presumptive starting point? How do we do what Dan has done in Washington State, which is seek to end the death penalty and recognize that's not our vision and shouldn't be a just system that we're trying to perpetuate? And how do we think about those pillars around accountability and transparency? So we've tried to put it out there. We've tried to give concrete examples with every principle of where in the country you can see something that looks like this principle, with the hope that eventually this is the finish line that we're moving toward.
And I have a question for all the panelists. I'm going to ask Emily to answer it first if she doesn't mind. So the Brennan Center recently hosted an event with James Foreman Jr., Rachel Barkow, and Paul Butler from Georgetown, and we discussed the criminal justice reform movement, and we discussed prosecutors. And both of them spoke about this article that Emily also writes about in her book. And it was written in 2001 by Abby Smith, who was the co-director of the Criminal Defense Clinic at Georgetown Law. I was a student at the clinic at the time, actually, and I was thinking about going to a prosecutor's office. And the title of her article was, "Can you be a good person and a good prosecutor?"
And her answer was no.
And her answer was no. It was very controversial at the time. And, Abby talks about how, career prosecutors, friends of hers, were, just horrified that she would write such an article and answer it that way. And, since then, Georgetown Law professor Paul Butler has dedicated an entire chapter of his 2009 book, Let's Get Free, A Hip-Hop Theory of Justice. 10 years later, Emily writes about this in her book as well. And you have just spent the last few years deeply entrenched in prosecutors' offices, in this movement, interviewing defendants, interviewing family members, interviewing so many people touched by not only prosecutors' offices, but the entire spectrum of the justice system. So I'm curious, what do you think?
So I love Abby and I love Paul Butler, and I think their deep skepticism is actually really useful and important. You have to understand, if you look at the country as a whole, how unusual these folks are. There are more than 2,400 elected prosecutors across the country. There are just not, it depends how you count, but there are not very many people who can lay claim to being a progressive prosecutor. There are 5 district attorneys in New York City. I would argue that none of the other 4 are meeting that definition. So, what you see from people like Paul and Abby is a sense of prosecutors are going to prosecute. And if you don't want to be locking up a lot of low-income Black and brown people, this is not the job for you. I've talked with Paul and Abby recently. I keep checking in with them, have you changed your mind? Because I tell my law students that I think it's really important for ethical, committed people to be on both sides of the adversarial system. That if we give up on sending people to Dan and Eric's offices, because we don't think that progressives or liberals should be playing that role, that's a lot of power to hand off to people who you might not agree with. I don't think they've really completely changed their minds. And so I think this is just this fundamental tension. Is this model going to prove out? Dan is especially unusual because he's been in office for 12 years. But most of these folks just got elected the day before yesterday. Kind of useful for my book. The movement is so young that, we have to, it hasn't screwed up yet. But it could prove a disappointment. It could prove to produce very incremental change. Think about the 80% number that Dan was talking about, or, even cut 50, which is a kind of slogan in the criminal justice reform movement. We are very far from those outcomes. And so I think, again, this sense that there are people who are going to be holding the feet to the fire of elected officials who are making different claims, and making sure that this idea of a progressive prosecutor doesn't get kind of diluted. There have been other people, in years previous who claimed to be doing something kind of different and then didn't really follow through. And so I think when you talk to people like Abby and Paul, they're saying, prove it to me. I want to see it. I'm not sure I see it yet.
And so Eric and Dan, I'm curious, why should good people be prosecutors?
Well, I'm going to say I believe that they are simply wrong. I think that, as a prosecutor, we have to do a much better job in acknowledging that the criminal justice system, the origins, the systemic racism, that it was used to hold people back. We have to make acknowledgments of how the system has failed us, and how it's particularly been used to hold back African Americans and others in this country. That being said, prosecutors play an important role in helping, I think, shape what could be safe communities and the things that we're doing to, to talk about mental health and to treat addiction in different ways and to do that. So, and I've seen the change. I remember when Professor Butler wrote his book, I remember during that period of time how difficult it was to get the best law students from around the country to apply to DA's offices because that sentiment was so real, but it's changing. And as people have seen what DAs are doing throughout the country, even if it's only small places, even if it's not numerically a large number of places, has been in pretty big offices where they can effect massive change. We're seeing some of the best and brightest and most committed law students now applying to our offices. So I think good people can be prosecutors. I think that we want them to continue to feel that they can make systemic change if they come into the office, and that they are not just case processors, but they're actually giving real discretion in how to effectuate justice. And for me, it's, like Dan, we're different because we were not part of, outsiders who were elected to transform an office. Both of us were insiders who knew that there could be a better way to run our offices and to do a better job. So I think there's a lot of hope. There's going to be a lot of opportunities for people who come from the defense perspective or come from other perspectives to change offices. But I bet you in virtually every DA's office in the country, there are people in there who would love to change the way their office operates.
I'd say it isn't a matter of good person or evil person. It's really about arrogance or humility. And I've certainly met prosecutors who I thought were very arrogant and would not admit the inherent limitations of what they can do to help people who are struggling with parts of the human condition. We have our mission statement includes the line that we exercise our power with humility and fairness. And humility that was a word chosen by the people in my office, and I thought that's refreshing. And it is something that we remind ourselves. We don't have the answer to everything. The answer to everything can't be a long prison sentence. Now, it is in certain cases. You commit a serious violent crime, you kill people, you shoot people, you're gonna face one of our trial prosecutors, and they're not going to apologize for sending you to prison. But for so many of the complicated social problems that come to our office, they don't come to us because we're the best option. They come to us because we're the only option. See, the essence of criminal justice reform is to envision something that's not there and to build something that's not there, and to do that in partnership and in a sustainable way. To build the LEAD program took us many years to get the money, continues to be a struggle to get the money that we need to build that thing that isn't there. So the humility that's required to be an effective leader and effective prosecutor, it starts with acknowledging that the stuff that comes to us just comes to us because we've already been built. And the things that would be a more effective solution haven't been built yet, but they could be, and there's a community out there waiting to partner with you to do that. So that's why I think also the pace of criminal justice reform is frustratingly slow, because building those things up, it takes time.
And we're sitting here at NYU Law. I see some first-year law students in the room, some second years, some third years. So a lot of the students sitting here are thinking, should I join a prosecutor's office? Should I join a public defender's office? And, and Miriam, I know that your organization is starting to think about how to work with law students as they make those tough decisions. Can you talk a little bit about what you tell them and some of the work that you're doing as they start to think through, how do I want to spend my career?
Sure. So, and I think there may even be some of our summer fellows in the room. Can you raise your hand if you're one of our summer fellows? I think that they're out there. They're probably being shy. Yeah, okay. So they're probably together over there, and they all said, you raise your hand. So at least one of you did. We are very much trying to embrace the view that we got to bring about change from the top down, but it's only going to be sustained if we also carry forward and bring about that change from the bottom up, and then try to really break down the middle level management that can often be resistant to culture change. So I'm going to, in a rare moment, disagree with just one small thing, Emily, that you said, which is we actually are going into law schools and trying to say to students there, if you don't enjoy locking people up, especially young people of color, you need to be in a prosecutor's office. Because every decision that a prosecutor makes to take away somebody's liberty should really hurt and should be difficult and should keep you awake at night and should cause you to want to bring a new vision to your job. And if we're going into law schools and pitching this, if you think you want to be a public defender, you know, that would be great, but we would also love to see you in a prosecutor's office, because we somehow need to break down this notion that this is an adversarial process where both sides are pitted against each other, and instead embrace the view that we're jointly seeking the pursuit of a just result. And we need to join forces to try to bring about changes to the justice system. So through our Summer Fellows program, through other efforts, we're really trying to break down that starting point and to look for individuals who recognize, as Eric and Dan have articulated, that we shouldn't be defining people by the worst thing that they've done. We need to really try to stay more proximate to those who come into the justice system and look for the humanity in every individual and try to find what is the pathway that's going to be right for them and right for the community, while realizing that prison is rarely going to answer that question in the affirmative in both of those instances. So we're trying to find those individuals and encourage them to make their way into offices like this. And it may be that they're now small in number, but they're growing. And they're growing in urban areas and other parts of the country where criminal justice reform hasn't necessarily been the norm. And I really think that we're looking at a new normal in the field that is only going to grow larger as time goes on.
And an important component to all of this change is offering the public another answer than when you've been a victim of a crime, that the only thing the government can do is to lock somebody up. And I'm not going to get into too much of this right now, but it is more and more apparent to me that if we gave victims and survivors of crimes other options, that they would choose incarceration less and less in a lot of cases. That right now the only solution we give them is the sense that if we take it seriously only if the person went to jail.
And Emily, I'm going to end my last question with you. You know, the book is so compelling because you trace the journey that two different characters take through the justice system. Vastly different journeys, vastly different jurisdictions, one in Brooklyn, one in Tennessee, and they were treated quite differently by their prosecutors' offices. This storytelling device really, really, I think, drives home more than, you know, anything I've ever read, why a prosecutor's discretion and power is so important. Can you talk a little bit, you know, I know the word mercy comes up in your book a lot. Can you talk about that and, you know, why prosecutors have this just potential to grant mercy in a way that very few other public actors do?
Well, because we've given them this role where their discretion is driving so many decisions. And I think, you know, thank you. That was my goal for my book. I care a lot about storytelling. That's what I can bring, right? Like, I'm a journalist. That's what I'm supposed to be good at. So that was definitely the idea. You know, when you spend time with people who are caught up in the criminal justice system, you start to see it from their point of view. Like, that is also part of my job. And I think this idea that people deserve second chances, which is a bipartisan, very mainstream idea, which I see gaining ground all over the country. You know, Florida restores the vote to formerly incarcerated people by 66% of the vote in Florida in November. It's an idea that has religious underpinnings. It has a lot of moral force behind it. And I think it's strong enough to kind of counter this impulse that we had in the 80s and 90s, that we had to protect ourselves by separating people and essentially locking them up and pretending that we could throw away the key. And that's wrong. Almost everyone who goes to jail or prison comes home. And so thinking about the effects that incarceration has on them is crucial for the community and for all of us. So thank you. I mean, I hope that the stories of the people in my book just allow some of us who don't have these experiences ourselves to kind of think through their experiences a little and see the world through their eyes and imagine, the power of second chances from their point of view.
Now we have time for audience questions. We have 2 mics that are being set up right now. Please step forward. We'd love to hear from our audience. Step up to the mic. Please tell us your name. Please do ask a question, and I know there are a lot of lawyers in the room. Please ask a one-part question. Please do your best. I know you can. So we'll start over here.
Hello there. Is this working? I'm an attorney at Public Rights Project, which I think some of you may know. I know Miriam knows our founder. And we do work with civil and criminal prosecutors on thinking about how these offices can be protecting public rights, civil rights, consumer protection, workers' rights. And so loaded question is, what do you think of your roles in your offices? So I guess for Eric and Dan, of prosecutors protecting the rights of vulnerable people, whether it's going after wage theft claims or other corporate crimes, because I think under-enforcement in some of these communities is also one of the sources of the problems. And I know Emily spoke to trust, and is that a component that you're thinking about building trust with your communities?
So absolutely, it's something that I talk about all the time when I'm in Brooklyn, that I talk about using the resources of the office as we're, making our footprint smaller in the criminal justice system by using it in ways that actually protect the public, in terms of treating workers with dignity and making sure that people aren't taking advantage of workers, and also using our resources to prosecute cases that have gone under-prosecuted. It's in communities of color in particular, there's a sense that law enforcement does not care about communities of color when they're victims of crime, and so that not only are we making sure that we're being fair on our, the cases we prosecute, but that we actually have the resources to protect vulnerable populations and prosecute cases that in the past may have been ignored or under-investigated. Within about a year ago, maybe a little bit more than a year ago, I created a cold case unit in my office using, I think, resources. There were no added resources given to my office, but since then we've helped solve with the police department 6 cold case homicides. One was a couple of months ago, but it was a young woman who had been raped and shot and killed in Brownsville on a rooftop in 1992. We had the evidence to investigate that case, but it had gone, ignored because she didn't have someone really speaking out for her and using the resources that we're saving to protect vulnerable populations. So yes and yes.
And did you want to answer?
I would just say very quickly that the most vulnerable and marginalized people in our society come to us in with the label crime victim. Now, I also know that many people who are crime victims have also been perpetrators of crime, have also been, it's not an easy one-size-fits-all little box that you're a crime victim. I want to see going forward, and this is just a vision, why can't we use that interaction with the criminal justice system as a place to provide the kinds of supports that we know people need? If you've been a victim of a crime and your case is now in the prosecutor's office, why can't we have a navigator who can help work with you to get you stable housing? Maybe you need help with substance use disorder or behavioral health issues. Why can't we just use that as an intervention point? The way that we are now with people who we're arresting, and the same services that we're giving people in our LEAD program and in other programs, why can't we give those to crime victims as well? So I think it's an opportunity for us to build some more trust and not just use victims to come in and help us prove the case and then say goodbye, see you later, because they're just as vulnerable, if not more, than they were when they came to us. So that's another principle we can add to the list, is like, let's make sure that we treat people holistically and give them the support that they need when they interact with our system.
And we'll go to the second mic. We have a really long line of quite engaged listeners today, so please do remember to keep your question to one part. Thanks.
Okay. And I'm also a Mike. Okay. I'm Mike Diedrich, and I'm actually running for district attorney in Rockland County, open seat for the Serve American Party, SAM Party. My question is not really a question, but
But you've admitted it, so it's okay.
What one part question?
I do civil rights law. I volunteered to represent somebody that I've never met in a prisoner abuse case. And I just received from him over the weekend his story, a letter about his background. I couldn't put it down. I've never met the guy yet, but it might be, the question might be whether anybody might want to investigate this and write a book about this guy. But the bottom line is, in reading this, if what he says is true, and I have no reason to doubt him because it sounds like he's owning up to all sorts of things, he didn't do any crime of violence, no one ever hurt, and no significant amount of money ever stolen. He robbed with a fake gun a few fast food stores. He's serving 52 years in prison, and that was going in initially, and then going out on parole, violating parole, going back for 2 years, having in Alabama, we read in the New York Times about the conditions in Alabama. It was so horrible for him, he was suicidal and decided to escape, which he did without violence. That added another 10 years, and then he finally escaped again. He ended up with no violence and only minimal amount of property loss. He's serving a total of a bunch of consecutive terms, 52 years. And he seems like a decent guy who owns up to his misdeeds. And the question would be, I don't see any remedy, the parole board, but this is something that I think our society needs to address. He's in prison for his whole of his life, basically, for doing stuff as a young man and then doing reasonable other things. And that's not a question, it's just a statement.
Well,
Dan,
I'll just say most prosecutors would hate this answer, but I'm going to give you the answer that I like. I think there should be a mechanism for a second look for excessive sentencing. Right now we have clemency, which is slow. It's political. There's
Tiny.
usually nothing in it for the governor, you know. But I've brought 21 clemency cases in my office to governors, supported the release of people who I thought had been given excessive sentencing. Sometimes you can find a legal hook to go back to the court and do that, but we shouldn't have to be inventing those things, and I think we should not be afraid to go back and look at some of the sentences that people are serving, because if we've been doing this job long enough, you know what is within the range of reasonable, and then you know the things that shock the conscience. We just need to create some ability to go back and look at these sentences, and what that looks like, I'm not sure yet.
So let me briefly add. So FJP is actually bringing the prosecutors we work with together later this year to have a conversation around how do we dispense justice, not simply prospectively, but also how do we correct past injustices in a way that Dan did, in a way that Eric is looking at, and a few of the other DAs that we work with. I think that we really need to own the injustices of those who are serving decades behind bars and look for whatever vehicle we can find, which might also include legislative change, as recently happened in California, to try to unlock our prison doors and enable those who no longer pose a danger to our community, who were simply spending millions of dollars paying to house, who can be safely back in our community, knowing that we're continuing to do damage to their loved ones and their community. How can we figure out a way to create those mechanisms?
And a plug for our Brennan Center report. We recently issued a report called "How Many Americans Are Unnecessarily Incarcerated," finding that almost 40% of those people behind bars today in state and federal prisons don't need to be there if you look at public safety. So that's just a look at public safety, a very conservative estimate. So we have a long way to go. I'd love to take a question from here.
So my name is Richard Barr, and this is for District Attorney Gonzalez. I think it's terrific that under you and under your immediate predecessor, long-standing unjust prosecutions that went through the office in the Joe Hines years and even earlier in the Liz Holtzman years have been re-examined and that it's resulted in the release from prison of people who were unjustly convicted, and if they've already been released, then having their records cleared. And that's terrific. And it seems to me, though, that the exoneration of people unjustly convicted is one side of the coin. And the other side is the perpetrators of the unjust convictions. And it seems to me that, and I'd like to know what you have to say about this, that rogue police lieutenants like Louis Scarcella and rogue prosecutors like Michael Vecchione should have to be held accountable for what they did, and I would like to know what you think about that.
I mean, the issue of accountability is something that I support. I have, indicated that prosecutors should not be beyond being held accountable for bad acts. In terms of any individual person, I'm not going to comment, but we've taken a look at some of our wrongful convictions when we found sort of malicious and what we may believe would be intentional wrongdoing, whether or not any criminal charges could to lie. The trouble with that, and I think for all the lawyers in the room, know that these incidents were 20, 25, 30 years ago, and statutes of limitations have run. I know that others have given some thought about what could be done on these cases. But New York State has a new prosecutorial misconduct commission, and so we will see what happens in the future with these things. But it's something that my office spends a lot of time thinking about. What does accountability look like? And I think for the first time, we just vacated our 25th wrongful conviction. We did something we haven't done on the other 24, which is we publicly issued a report about what went wrong, and we said it as it was. So we're not sparing anyone's feelings. When a prosecutor was responsible, or a judge was responsible, a defense attorney, whoever the systematic players were in these wrongful convictions, we are looking to expose that so that there will be some transparency and accountability in of itself. And we're looking to see what we can do with the other 24 cases that are currently sealed, but whether or not some kind of general report can be issued so that there can be a true accountability for people's conduct and behavior. And for me, it's also looking forward to make sure that none of my prosecutors ever make those mistakes again.
Thank you. Over here.
Yes, I am Maria Roca, and I am a member of the Sunset Park community since the 1960s, where we also saw very similar unfolding of misjustice as did East New York. So I'm here, I'm very encouraged to see this level of scholarship and intent in the interest of constructive justice versus destructive justice, which I'm sad to say I witnessed personally. I founded a small neighborhood, all-volunteer organization called Friends of Sunset Park when I, after a brief absence, came back to Sunset Park and saw that many things were the same, unfortunately, not for the better, but for the worse. And so in my work with young people and their families, the word keeps popping up, but life's not fair, and it's not fair because that's how young people often internalize. I'm addressing this to the entire panel. What are your offices or your work doing to engage not only young people at the middle school and high school level, but also the educators, the teachers, where often that unfairness and that injustice plays out in the schools? So it's not just the justice system. There's a lot of injustice in our public schools. So that's my question.
So I think the question is, it sounds like it's about sort of prevention and really rethinking prosecutors in the community.
I'll just say quickly, we have a truancy law in our state, and it gives the prosecutor the ability to file cases in court for when kids stop going to school. We've taken that instead and used that moment to do a series of workshops. I have people in my office who arrange workshops at the school with the school representative and the youth who stop going to school. I don't want them to go to court. I want them to go to school, so we will file the case, but then we'll stay it immediately. We'll have that meeting and do a contract with the school district and the youth and their parents, try to figure out why they're not going to school, because that's the number one crime prevention strategy that we can all pursue, is to keep young people in school. Once they drop out of school, they're 5 times more likely to go to prison during their lifetime. So sometimes it's a learning difficulty. Sometimes the parents don't understand the value of education, and so that's our community engagement with schools, is to try to help keep those cases from coming to us. And we also don't file cases that necessarily come from the school campus if they can be dealt with a different sort of disciplinary approach on campus. So that's one of the downsides of having school resource officers, police officers on campus, is that often the administration will just turn those cases over to the SRO, and they don't know anything more than to take the case to us when it should have been resolved at a school with some sort of restorative justice program.
For me, it's a combination of various approaches. My wife's a public school teacher, so I've been very committed to trying to figure out how I could best support our schools. We spend a considerable amount of our resources on doing programming with schools, after school, weekend events, from sporting events to academic events. We have a chess program. We have a bunch of other things that the office helps pay for to be involved with our schools. I think for me, one of the things that I did was, again, say that these cases did not belong in our local criminal courts. So I supported Raise the Age in 2016. Most of our cases in Brooklyn now are starting to go to our family courts, but I'm also partnering with my office to do things on bullying and cyber terrorism, basically, because that's what it is with these kids, to try to make sure that the office is seen as a resource to parents and to children, and not simply as someone who's adding to the difficulties of it. But largely, I'm moving away from school-based offenses in my office and saying that's not the role of the Brooklyn DA's office.
We have time for one more question, so we can take it from this mic over here.
Hi.
One part question, please.
Sorry. My name is Hannah Howard. I'm a student here at NYU. A good person, I think, that wants to do prosecution. And my question is about kind of these ATI programs that you're talking about. I think they're wonderful, certainly a much needed change, but they don't actually shrink the role of the prosecutor. I think they really expand it. And in ways I think that really require people to make decisions and to play roles that they're not prepared for at all. So I wonder if you think the end goal is that we should be getting better people that are making those decisions, or really if we should be kind of drastically changing the machinery so that the prosecutors aren't kind of ultimate decision makers in the ways that they always have been.
It's a great observation, actually. It's really a very astute observation of the system, that as we put in more alternatives to incarceration, we make sort of getting through the justice system a little bit more complicated. For my office, one of the things that, it actually came out during Emily writing her book, was about the role of prosecutors in making decision points during an ATI and not trained social workers. And so we have pivoted in Brooklyn, but it does actually make the role of prosecutors a little bit more complex, because we're in a area that we're not best suited for, right? We're in an area where we're trying to help provide rehabilitative services. That is a switch for DA's offices. So the type of people that my office is looking to bring in now are actually people with, that kind of expertise, right? Starting to hire more social workers and people who are licensed to do this type of work, as opposed to prosecutors who are always very risk adverse and make decisions. I think you could speak to it, but it is a very, very important acknowledgement that as we do more ATIs, it becomes a lot more difficult for both the defense and for those accused to navigate the system.
You're really talking about unintended consequences, right? And the concern that in trying to make the system more merciful, it can also just ensnare people in these long-term relationships with the court system that in the end don't make things better. I think it's absolutely an important concern to keep all of our eyes on. I also think as I look around the country, there are places where these programs don't exist at all. So we both need to make the ones that exist as sensitive to this concern as possible so they can be models, and then also recognize that just having the conversation is kind of a luxury.
Emily Bazelon, thank you for joining us today. We really wish you the best of luck with your brand new book. Thank you. Charge, the new movement to transform American prosecution and end mass incarceration. To our